This is the last moment of Rick Davies, a man whose fingers once danced across the piano with thunder and grace, whose voice was the shadowy counterpoint to Supertramp's brightest anthems left this world in silence. But before he did, those close to him noticed something. His music stopped speaking long before his body gave up. The final note was not sung on stage. It was swallowed by the quiet. He was never one to chase the spotlight. While other rock legends shouted, Rick whispered through melancholic piano lines, jazz-infused riffs, and lyrics laced with sarcasm and sorrow. But what happens when a man who never wanted to explain himself faces the end? What truths stay unspoken? And why, even after decades of music? Does it feel like Rick Davies took something with him that the world will never recover? The Rick Davies was not just a founding member of Supertramp, and he was Supertramp. From the jazzy chaos of Rudy to the cynical wit of Bloody Well, right? His hands shaped the sound of a generation, but behind every tour, every hit, every sold-out arena, there was a man slowly pulling away not just from fame, but from those who built that sound with him. When Roger Hodgson left the band in 1983, many believed it was the beginning of the end. Yet Rick continued, alone at the helm, steering Supertramp into darker, more personal waters. Fans noticed the shift. The energy on stage changed. The lyrics grew heavier, the voice raspier. And still, Rick never explained. By 2015, a serious health diagnosis silenced what little remained of his public presence. Tours were canceled. Reunions were denied. And while fans held out hope, the Rick's world grew smaller, until the only echoes left were those of the music he'd already made. On the 6th of September, 2025, Rick Davies passed away in East Hampton, New York. No final tour. No farewell album. Just an empty spotlight where the music used to be. But this isn't just a story about a death. It's about a silence that began long before a silence full of unresolved tension, unspoken feuds, and a legacy both brilliant and unfinished. It began without promises, before the world ever heard his name. Rick Davies was a young man working as a welder, watching his dream of becoming a musician fade like steam on a factory window. He had already formed a band, Rick's Blues, in his college years. He had even taught a future pop star, Gilbert O'Sullivan, how to play drums. But when his father fell ill, Rick did what many from working-class backgrounds are taught to do. He let go of the dream. Temporarily. Because music, for Rick, wasn't a hobby, it was an instinct. In 1966, he took a job as an organist with The Joint, a band playing low-budget gigs and recording soundtracks for obscure European films. The money was small, the room smoky, and the audiences indifferent. But in one of those foreign recording sessions, in a studio far from home, Rick met Stanley August Miesgaes, a Dutch millionaire with a soft spot for music and misfits. Miesgaes offered to fund Rick's vision. Not just a record. A band. Rick returned to London and posted an ad in Melody Maker magazine. One of the first to answer, a shy, spiritual young guitarist named Roger Hodgson. Rick and Roger couldn't have been more different. One was gritty, grounded, and practical. The other dreamy, philosophical, and full of ethereal falsetto. But from that tension, something remarkable bloomed. Supertramp. In 1970, the band released their debut album. It flopped. So did the second. But Rick didn't quit. Through shifting lineups and musical experimentation, he pushed forward. By 1974, with a stable lineup and a more focused sound. Supertramp released Crime of the Century, a haunting, cinematic album that finally turned heads. Suddenly, everything changed. Concert halls filled, critics took notice. The blend of Rick's biting, satirical lyrics and Roger's soaring melodies created a musical identity that was both cerebral and catchy. Songs like Bloody Well, right? Rudy, and Dreamer became radio staples. And then came Breakfast in America. Released in 1979, it was the band's commercial peak. The album hit #1 in the US and sold millions. Tracks like the logical song, Take the Long Way Home, and Goodbye Stranger became generational anthems. Supertramp wasn't just successful, they were global. Yet, behind the scenes, the very duality that made them brilliant was beginning to splinter. Creative tension between Rick and Roger intensified. They had always written songs separately but agreed to share credits. Now, that illusion of unity began to unravel. Rick's music grew darker, jazzier, more experimental. Roger leaned toward spiritual optimism and catchy hooks. The studio became a battleground of subtle resistance, two voices trying to speak through the same mouth. In 1983, Roger Hodgson left Supertramp. To many fans, this was a heartbreak. But to Rick, it was a transition. He didn't chase his former partner or attempt to replace him. He took the helm fully, steering the band into new territory. Songs like Cannonball and My Kind of Lady showed his range not just vocally, but emotionally. The latter, in particular, showcased Rick's ability to sing in 3 different tones, from deep and gravelly to delicate falsetto, all in one track. It was a musical statement. He was still here. But success didn't feel the same. The charts were shifting. The world wanted pop icons, not introspective pianists. Supertramp's albums under Rick's solo leadership received critical respect but lukewarm commercial response. Still, he toured, wrote, and released music on his own terms. Then, quietly, Rick vanished from the stage. In 1997, the fans were surprised when Supertramp reunited with Rick leading the revival. 2 more albums followed, but something had changed. The sound was more polished. The danger, the fire had flickered. The world had changed. And perhaps Rick had too by 2015. As anticipation built for what was billed as a final tour, the shocking news arrived. Rick Davies had been diagnosed with multiple myeloma, a form of blood cancer. The tour was canceled. The band went silent. Publicly, Rick said little. Privately, he retreated. He never spoke ill of Roger, never addressed the creative split. He never made a statement about the end of Supertramp. Instead, his silence became the final chapter of the band's history. But there was one last act, quiet, intimate, and nearly forgotten. In 2022, Rick appeared at a bar in Amagansett, New York, playing a small show with Ricky and the Rockets. It wasn't a comeback. It wasn't even an official gig. Just a man and his music, stripped of expectation. That performance, witnessed by only a handful, was the last time Rick Davies would play in public. There were no camera crews, no documentaries, no farewell interviews. Just the sound of a piano and a man who had already said everything he needed to say. So what was Rick Davies really trying to say? Through decades of melodies and guarded interviews, maybe he never wanted us to know. To understand Rick Davies, you have to go back to a time when rock was still raw. untamed, and dripping with rebellion. The late 1,960 seconds and early 70 seconds weren't just a cultural shift, they were a revolution. Guitars were loud, egos were louder, and the music industry was addicted to the next big sound. But while many chased fame through theatrics and excess, Rick Davies took a different path. Born in 1944 inches Swindon, England, a working-class town with no promise of stardom, Rick's early life was as far from the glitz of rock arenas as one could imagine. He wasn't a prodigy from a conservatory. He was the boy who fell in love with music through a dusty old record player and a Gene Krupa drum solo. It started with rhythm. As a child, Rick was fascinated by the cadence of snare drums echoing through the streets during parades. That rhythm became his language first, through percussion, then piano, then songwriting. And unlike others who were groomed for the spotlight, Rick Davies had to teach himself every note, every chord. He built himself from the ground up, brick by brick, beat by beat. By the time he co-founded Supertramp in 1969, he wasn't just forming a band, he was crafting a sound that didn't quite fit anywhere else. It wasn't classic rock. It wasn't jazz. It wasn't pop. It was all of those things, stitched together with irony, wit, and a distinct sense of melancholic distance. Supertramp became the soundtrack of contradiction, biting lyrics hidden under upbeat melodies. Sadness, dressed up in bright suits. This wasn't accidental. Rick Davies, unlike his flamboyant counterpart Roger Hodgson, preferred to stay in the shadows. Hodgson's high-pitched, dreamy vocals soared in songs like The Logical Song and Give a Little Bit. Rick, in contrast, grounded the band with bluesy growls and sardonic storytelling. He wasn't the dreamer. He was the realist, the voice that reminded you the world doesn't always make sense. And yet, behind that gruff exterior, there was mystery. Rick rarely gave interviews. He avoided fame. While other frontmen became icons, Rick became invisible. Even as Breakfast in America conquered charts worldwide in 1979. The Davies stayed backstage content to let the music do the talking. But was that silence a choice or a shield? The world around him was changing. The 1,980 seconds brought synthesizers, MTV, and the glamorization of fame. Supertramp, under Rick's leadership, moved against the grain, embracing complexity in a time of simplicity. And slowly, without public explanation, the band began to fade from the spotlight. Hodgson left, the magic frayed, and Rick, now alone at the wheel, steered Supertramp into more progressive, brooding waters. In doing so, he carved out a legacy that was both respected and misunderstood. Supertramp was never just another rock band. It was a vessel for Rick's duality, an extrovert stage led by an introvert's mind, and that tension, that friction between fame and anonymity, success and silence became the invisible thread woven through his career. As the years passed, the mystery only grew. Why did he turn down reunions? Why did he cancel a final tour in 2015 without a public message? Why did someone who lived through so much say so little? Rick Davies wasn't just part of a generation that changed music. He was its quiet conscience. And the deeper we go into his story, the more we realize some of the most powerful voices never needed to shout. For most of his life, Rick Davies was a mystery hiding in plain sight. Fans knew his voice. They memorized his lyrics. They watched him at the piano, steady and focused, while the world around him swirled with fame, egos, and evolution. And yet, a few ever felt like they knew him. There were no scandals, No tabloid outbursts. No confessional memoirs. But that absence became its own story. Because behind every hit, behind every sold-out show, there was always something unsaid. Rick never explained why he refused reunion offers with Roger Hodgson, even when fans begged for it. He never revealed what really happened in the final studio sessions before Hodgson left in 1983, and he never clarified why, at the height of his career, he became harder and harder to reach, not just for journalists, but for some fellow musicians. People around him noticed the shift. Studio engineer Peter Henderson once commented that during the recording of Breakfast in America, Rick and Roger still worked in harmony. But by the next album, something had changed. They no longer collaborated. Songs were brought in separately. Disagreements were quiet, but cold. That what happened between them was never made public, but the music itself told the story. In Just Another Nervous Wreck, Rick sings, "I am feeling so alone now. They cut the telephone now." The lyrics, though not confirmed to be autobiographical, seemed more and more like quiet cries in disguise. He wasn't a frontman who smiled for cameras or sold his soul to press tours. He turned down high-profile interviews. He declined to discuss his personal life. Even in moments when he could have shaped the narrative, Rick remained silent. It wasn't out of arrogance. It was something else. A quiet resistance, a need to protect a part of himself that the industry could never reach. There were moments when the truth peeked through. In a rare 2018 interview, years after his cancer diagnosis, Rick appeared frail but lucid. When asked about a potential Supertramp reunion, he gave a soft, the final answer. "I don't think that's going to happen. There are things that were never really resolved, and that's okay." That sentence, simple as it was, carried a weight no headline could hold. He didn't speak about Hodgson directly. He didn't criticize. He didn't blame. But for the first time, he acknowledged what so many had suspected. The band's fracture wasn't just professional. It was personal. And it never healed. There were other silences, too. In the last decade of his life, Rick rarely appeared in public. He made no farewell statement. He didn't post on social media. While other artists from his era leaned into nostalgia tours, anniversary box sets, or legacy projects, Rick remained absent. He wasn't trying to preserve the past. He was letting it go, even within the industry. This created confusion. Why wouldn't a man so central to rock history speak up for his own legacy? But maybe that was the legacy. Rick Davies was a man who poured everything into the music itself. And when the music stopped, he didn't try to replace it with noise. And his final known performance in 2022 was almost a secret, at a small venue called Stephen Talkhouse. Hidden in the quiet town of Amagansett, Rick joined a local band for a modest jam session. He didn't advertise it. He didn't record it. It wasn't a grand goodbye. Just a man with a keyboard, playing for the love of it. For those who attended, the night was surreal. Rick looked older, slower. But when his hands touched the keys, the fire returned. There was no fanfare. No encore. Just a few songs. A soft thank you. And then he was gone. 3 years later, on the 6th of September, 2025, the news quietly broke. Rick Davies had passed away from complications related to multiple myeloma. No final tour. No farewell album. No public statement. But fans noticed something chilling. In his final interviews, he never spoke about legacy. He spoke only of peace. And maybe that's the truth we're left with. Rick Davies didn't leave behind scandal or chaos. And he left behind silence. but it was a silence full of meaning, a refusal to perform one last time just because the world expected it, a decision to exit on his own terms, without applause. That silence is deafening because it reminds us that even the loudest voices in music can carry their deepest truths in what they don't say. Rick Davies didn't need a stage to say goodbye. He had already done that in the pauses, in the breakdowns, in the final notes of songs most people never heard on the radio. And somewhere in that quiet is the answer we'll never fully understand. Rick Davies never chased myths. He never built an image. And maybe that's what makes him one of the most quietly fascinating figures in music history. As we explored his story, the rise, the rift, the silence, it became increasingly clear that Rick Davies was never playing the same game as everyone else in the industry. While others built careers around visibility, Rick's was shaped around absence, around restraint, around the belief that the music should speak louder than the man. And in many ways, it did. Supertramp's catalog, especially during their golden years. I wasn't just popular, it was emotionally intricate. Every album felt like a diary written in code. But now, looking back, we can't help but ask, how much of it was Rick's truth? How many of those sharp lyrics and bluesy breakdowns were reflections of inner conflict, of dreams deferred, of friendships lost? There's no dramatic scandal in Rick's story. No public meltdown. No fall from grace. But that doesn't mean his legacy is clean and simple. It's complicated. Rick Davies was a genius, yes, but also a gatekeeper of his own truth. And while his artistry was undeniable, some fans still wonder what could have been. What if he had reconciled with Roger Hodgson? What if Supertramp had given fans the reunion they begged for? What if Rick had given just one revealing interview before his death? Well, never know. But perhaps that's what makes his story so unique. In the age of overexposure, Rick Davies remains a reminder that mystery can be more powerful than confession, that walking away quietly can echo longer than the loudest exit. To some, and he was the mastermind who kept Supertramp grounded. To others, he was the reason the band never fully healed. To most, he was simply the man whose voice haunted their youth and whose songs still play in the background of life's most reflective moments. So, here's our take. Rick Davies was a man who gave everything through music and nothing through ego. He didn't need a final tour, a tell-all, or a legacy campaign. His legacy was the music, and maybe, in an era where everyone wants to be remembered loudly, his choice to go quietly is the loudest thing of all. But what do you think? Was Rick Davies a misunderstood genius, a reluctant icon, or a man whose silence masked deeper truths we'll never uncover? Tell us in the comments. Because like every great story in rock history, this one leaves just enough room for your own interpretation. There are stories that end with applause. Spotlights dim, curtains fall, the audience rises. But Rick Davies didn't get that ending. He didn't seem to want it. And maybe that was always the plan. He lived his life like his music. Understated. Layered. Slightly off-center. He never begged to be heard. And yet, his voice has never truly left us. Even now, decades after their prime. Supertramps. Songs still drift across late-night radio, spill through open windows, or play softly in quiet cafes. Goodbye, Stranger. Crime of the century. From now on, they're not just hits, they're time machines. Each note carries the weight of memories we didn't realize we still held on to. Rick Davies didn't sing about fame or luxury. He sang about loneliness, contradiction, disappointment, and the strange hope that somehow lives inside all of it. He was the voice of the commuter who missed their train, the thinker in a crowded room, the dreamer who couldn't quite escape reality. In his final years, Rick returned to where it all began. Small venues, simple shows, no fanfare, just music for the sake of music. No press release, no spectacle. That, in the end, was the real Rick Davies. We often think legacy is built on big endings, farewell tours, documentaries, tributes. But maybe the truest legacy is built on the quiet things, a chord progression that won't leave your head, a lyric that says what you've never been able to, a voice that feels like home, even after it's gone. Rick Davies never told us everything, but he left us just enough, and perhaps that's how the best stories are meant to end, not with answers, but with echoes. Because now you know a secret that once belonged only to him